On this day, 25th of January 1942, Thailand declares war on the United Kingdom and the United States. This came after air raids on the night of the 24th and 25th of January, in which American and British forces had bombed Bangkok. Raids had also happened on the 7th of January, and this was just over a month and a half since Japanese troops had been allowed to cross Thailand to invade Malaya and Burma. Thailand had now joined the Axis. Thailand was one of the few countries in East Asia that hadn't been colonized. They had managed to be the neutral territory between British and French territory. And they had also, before that, maintained good relations with both Britain and France. And this, in many ways, had led to both Britain and France deciding that it was better to have a neutral country in between their territories than trying to split it between themselves. So to the east there was French Indochina, to the south there was British Malaya, and to the west there was British Burma. Now, in 1932, the absolutist monarchy in Thailand was ended in something that was called the Siamese Revolution. It talked about how democracy came to Thailand in 1932, and there were some elections, but it wasn't democratic in a way that we would probably understand it. Very quickly it became an authoritarian military state. Thailand very well known for its coups. In 1938, a leader called Pibun became Prime Minister of Thailand. He exiled some royals that he didn't like, and he cracked down on various leftists and monarchists that opposed him. He also carried out campaign against the Chinese business class in Thailand in a similar way to the way that the Japanese were carrying out various pogroms against Chinese in their territories, and Jews by the Germans. So this was the 30s, and he was inspired by Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese. And he thought that he could use the same techniques that they were using to achieve what he wanted, which was a greater Thailand, modernized, powerful Thailand. Many of his techniques were quite, bordering on the fascist. Now, in 1939, he decided that he was going to change the name of Siam to Thailand. And Thailand was named after the Thai people, and it was very much aimed against non-Thai minorities like Laos and Malays, Burmese, Khmers, and others. He very much wanted this to make the point that this land was for the Thais. Anyone who wouldn't integrate and become Thai was not welcome. So he also copied the whole personality cult from various other regimes. His picture was put up everywhere in a way that the king's picture is now. He would be at the end of films in the cinema. You would have to stand up and bow to his picture. Again, very much in the way that Thais do to the king nowadays. And his picture was all over, on posters, all over town, all around the country. And he used very much the radio, which was a very new thing back then, cinema obviously, and the papers. and the papers were only allowed to print things that made him look good. So it's almost like Thailand hasn't changed very much since the 1930s. Anyway, in 1940, France was defeated by Germany. This led to problems all around the world because suddenly France and the Dutch and the Belgians were no longer able to protect their territories abroad. The French especially were exposed in North Africa and in Southeast Asia. French Indochina was already being picked off by Japan. Japanese troops started occupying, or they were being allowed to occupy areas near the Indo-Chinese border. The whole excuse was they wanted to prevent weapons going to the Chinese. But they very quickly started occupying most of the north, and then they started occupying the south. Pi Bun saw this as an opportunity to pick off lands that 100 years before had belonged to Thailand, or Siam. And so between 1940 and 41, the Franco-Thai War was waged, and obviously the French weren't really able to put up a fight because Vietnam was being occupied by the Japanese, and they couldn't send troops out because about 2 million French troops were prisoners of war in Europe. They didn't have much to send out and help. So he began an invasion in January of 1941 after a series of border clashes in 1940. And the French had won at sea, the Battle of Ko Chang. They destroyed the Thai fleet, but on land they were less successful. And eventually the Japanese stepped in and they made them come to an agreement. So Thailand would get about half of modern-day Cambodia and various chunks of Laos that are on the west side of the Mekong River. So this was portrayed as a great victory by Pi Bun over the imperialist French. And so he did gain some popularity in Thailand at this point. They saw him making Greater Thailand real. So after this, Pi Bun actually became worried about Japan, and he was worried that they would invade Thailand. So he started trying to become friends with the Americans and the British. This didn't really work. The British and the Americans were both busy doing their own thing, and so he decided he was going to adopt a policy of neutrality. Now, this wasn't going to last very long, because on the 7th of December, the Japanese presented an ultimatum to the government to allow Japanese troops to pass through into British Malaya and British Burma. Fortunately for Pi Bun, he had skipped Bangkok. He was out in the countryside and he couldn't be contacted. It is said that he did this on purpose so that he would not be to blame when Thailand was forced, quote unquote, to become an ally or a puppet state of Japan. So he was being very careful, probably too clever by half, and he waited until events had brought about the situation that he knew was going to happen before he returned to Bangkok, and then he was like, oh well, I suppose I have to accept it because... So they were forced into a treaty, or quote unquote forced into a treaty with Japan, and at this point, this is when British and American planes started to bomb targets inside Thailand, because they were trying to stop Japanese troops crossing into Burma, and obviously there was the war in Malaya as well. So Thailand pretty much didn't do much for the rest of the war. They did take in prisoners of war, heard the bridge over the River Kwai. Many prisoners of war were treated abominably, and that was in Thailand. So, Thailand, well, let's see what happens. So, let's see what happened to Thailand after declaring war on Britain and the United States. Well, they already had received good chunks of land from French Indochina. After the Japanese invasion of Burma, they were able to gobble up chunks of territory from Burma, especially the Shan state up in the north, which gave them a border with Yunnan province in China, and they were able to gobble up a couple of what you call little princedoms down in Malaya. Kedah was one of them, next to Penang, and a few on the east coast. So they pushed their borders south, they pushed their borders north, east and west. So Thailand was quite large at this point. It was probably about 50% larger than it is now. So they were quite happy. Unfortunately, the war really didn't go well for the Japanese. They started being pushed back. In 1944, the British were liberating Burma and coming very close to the Thai border. At this point, 1943, Italy had surrendered and gone over to the Allies. But in 1944, this was the invasion of Europe. Thailand at this point, and Pibun especially, were very concerned. Also, they didn't like the fact that they were being called the Italy of Asia. So this was something that they thought was insulting, but also it was kind of true, because they weren't really bringing much to the fight. There weren't any Thai troops in Burma, for example, or Malaya or China fighting. So they weren't really much used except as a corridor to other places. Now, this would be Thailand's best chance really to get out of the war. They tried flipping, as the Italians had, but Britain and the United States ignored them. After the end of the war, we'll just skip straight ahead, I'm sure I'll talk about this more in future videos. After the end of the war, Thailand was lucky, because they had been such a minor part of the invasions and wars. The Americans kind of let them off. They had to give back all their territories that they took, but they weren't treated as a belligerent. They weren't treated as an Axis ally. And that is because the Americans wanted a stable, strong, non-communist state in Asia. And considering everything that was happening at the time, the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam, the beginnings of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Pathet Lao in Laos, the Chinese communists in China, eventually then a few years later the Korean War, they needed as many allies as they could get. And they were happy to accept even one as cretinous as Pibun's regime, although he had to go, obviously. He was replaced. And a new king came back from Switzerland and took over. So Pibun, well, he lost out, but Thailand was very lucky. Very lucky indeed. It wasn't treated like Japan or Germany. Okay. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Like, comment and subscribe.